On Elon Musk's X, the Everything app, the goblin that runs the White House, or should I say the golem that runs the White House,
must have the precious.
Stephen Miller said something that was illuminating. Interesting too, but illuminating is the word I want to use. Let me read it for you. Plenty of countries in history have experimented with importing a foreign labor class. The West is the first and only civilization to import a foreign labor class that is granted full political rights, including welfare and the right to vote. All visas are a bridge to citizenship. And then the next post, in America for generations now, the policy has been that anyone who would economically benefit from moving to the U.S. can do so, exercise their franchise in the U.S., and their children, the moment they are born, will be full American citizens with all the rights and benefits therein. Now that's Miller, and it's clear that he thinks that this state of affairs is bad, that it's bad that people can move to the U.S., become citizens, and their children are born citizens, and that instead, the United States, the West, should follow the example of other countries, nations, civilizations, and just import foreign labor and not give them any political rights. There's a couple big picture thoughts here. The first is that Miller's description of how things actually are in the United States is good. That's like the whole promise of American freedom. That was the promise of American freedom in the founding era, and it remains, I think, the promise of American freedom, that you can come here, make a life for yourself, and your children be born with full political rights. And in a real sense, the story of the American nation is the story of expanding the scope of who gets full political rights, who gets full social rights in this country. Miller clearly thinks this is bad. He looks in the 20th century and sees the period where we restricted immigration except for a handful of agricultural workers whom we then promptly expelled as the right way of doing things. He looks at the 19th century where we allowed Chinese laborers to come, work on railroads, and then we refused to grant them citizenship as the way things ought to be. And I suspect that he looks at the early 19th century, at least the first half of the 19th century, before the Civil War, where there are 4 million enslaved people doing that labor, and he says that's the way it ought to be. Miller looks at the antebellum United States, when there was again a large class of chattel slave laborers, and he sees that, where we had laborers with no political or social rights, as a better way of doing things than now, than the present, a better way of doing things than the 20th century, a better way of doing things than what has actually made the United States an exceptional nation. And that's another point to make, that his vision of a great America seems to look a lot more like, Saudi Arabia or one of the Gulf petrostates than it does anything in the American tradition. And I want to hone in on the antebellum United States because Miller's tweets seem to be reconstructing from first principles a set of ideas that slaveholders pushed during that period, or at least the late part of that period, in the 1840s and 1850s, as slavery, as cotton, became extremely lucrative. As slaveholding grew dramatically, as slaveholders became incredibly wealthy and very powerful. One of those slaveholders was James Henry Hammond, a South Carolina planter. He had served in the House of Representatives. He had served as governor of the state, and at this point, in the late 1850s, he was a senator from South Carolina. James Henry Hammond also found to have sexually abused his nieces, and of course, sexually abused the people he enslaved. Pedocon theory remains undefeated. James Henry Hammond, who would go on in 1858 to deliver what would be called the mudsill speech. This speech argued that all great societies must have a mudsill of laborers to do all of the menial work. Quote, "In all social systems, there must be a class to do the menial duties, to perform the drudgery of life. That is, a class requiring but a low order of intellect and but little skill. Its requisites are vigor, docility, fidelity. Such a class you must have, or you would not have that other class which leads progress, civilization, and refinement. It constitutes the very mudsill of society and of political government, and you might as well attempt to build a house in the air as to build either the one or the other except on this mudsill." Fortunately for the South, she found a race adapted to that purpose to her hand, a race inferior to her own, but eminently qualified in temper, in vigor, in docility, in capacity to stand the climate, to answer all her purposes. We use them for our purpose and call them slaves. Now, as always, it is funny to read the slaveholders describe their society as some great civilization, when contemporaneous observers said repeatedly that the slaveholding South was an impoverished, dystopian place of rampant brutality and lazy and shiftless elites who were essentially unable to do anything but inflict violence on those below them. And again, I'll mention Hammond sexually assaulted his nieces and his enslaved people, so not a great guy. But his theory here is that a great civilization has to have a menial class, that this menial class is that way from birth, that they're designed to be that way, that they're genetically destined to be that way. Perhaps that's how you would describe it today. And that the enslaved African Americans were that mudsill for the South. Now, Stephen Miller has not yet said that there is a class of people who are genetically destined to be servants, although the people in those far-right reactionary orbits do in fact say things like this on the regular. I'm looking at you, Curtis Yarvin. But his tweets there come awfully close to just recapitulating Hammond's mudsill theory, to recapitulating the old and brutal idea that some deserve to be on the bottom, that this is their fate and they do not get rights as a result. And the irony, of course, is that Miller says all of this in order to elevate American civilization as he sees it. But if anything makes this country exceptional, it has been the effort on part of millions of Americans across this country's history to prove that wrong, to prove the words of the Declaration of Independence, that we are all created equal, that we are all entitled to the same rights, that we are all entitled to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and that we are all entitled to govern ourselves in a democracy that respects and honors our basic equality. That's what makes the United States a special civilization, such that it is. And it is incredibly striking that is what Stephen Miller and the people around him hate the most. Thank you for watching, and if you like this video here, then you might enjoy this one right below me that I picked out for you. See you next time.